Okay, so I want to start. My first section is Beowulf, Art, and the Other, and this is a picture of the Grendel puppet from the production, and you'll see I've generally littered my PowerPoint with some nice photographs from the production. Briscoe, in a recent paper on Gunnarsson's film Beowulf and Grendel, notes there's been a recent surge in Beowulf production or adaptations in a variety of media forms. So I think there's been an opera, several films, there's been a number of graphic novels in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, this is partly due to fashion, arguably, but I think it's also partly to do with the themes and the content of the poem itself. Now, any adaptation begins by looking at a source text. And when I mean a source, I mean two things. I mean primary material for the adaptation and also a wellspring for creative ideas. And so really to understand my adaptation, I want to first look at some of the aspects of the original. And I hope to actually show just how thematically and you might say ideologically rich Beowulf as a poem is. And this kind of elided in some adaptations, arguably some adaptations recently. I don't know if you saw Zemeckis' 2007. It was one of the early 3D Beowulfs, and Beowulf's whole summation of his motivation was summed up in the quite simplistic phrase, "I'm here to kill your monster," which he continuously sort of tramps around Herot, just saying, I'm here to kill your monster. And I think this is something of a sad elision of some of the interesting themes within Beowulf. And so I hope to bring out some of these. Now, my reading is going to pick out three things concerning the poem. The first is the nature and status of the monsters in Beowulf, and indeed why they are monsters rather than bad weather or just spirits or other human beings. Next, I want to discuss the status of art and art making within the poem. I think there's a rich intertextuality within the poem that really deserves mention. And thirdly, I want to kind of tie this up with the idea of Beowulf as a character, as a kind of Nordic heroic archetype. And while you might say the original poem sort of runs the risk of a bland machismo about Beowulf as this just archetypal Nordic hero, I actually think Beowulf's character is rather richly interwoven with ideas of identity and art making. So first then to our monsters. Here we have Grendel. Now, early on in the work, we're given quite a complex description of the monster Grendel, who wages nightly attacks on Herot, the hall of King Hrothgar. And I'll put on my best poetry voice here. So here's a quote from Heaney's version, which I've used as the kind of the base translation. Then, a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear their din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck and the clear song of the skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings. So these lines are in, which some of the audience might be aware of, in sort of accentual meter, which is a four-stressed line with a heavy caesura in the middle, and basically nearly all Saxon poetry was conducted in this way. Indeed, the Saxons didn't have any rhyme, or they discovered rhyme very late, and indeed the first Saxon poem was actually called the rhyming poem. So it was this amazing technological feat brought over from France, and they thought it was all very, very clever indeed. But most Saxon poetry doesn't rhyme. But with this quote from Grendel, I think it picks out two of the major concerns of the poem. So salient things to note here are that Grendel is disturbed by music and poetry, and these present for him something intolerable. Though why? I think we have an indication here as he's described as a prowler through the dark. Time and again in the poem, Grendel is associated with places outside human habitation, especially around water. So, for example, the poem tells us that Grendel haunts the marshes, marauding around the heath and the desolate fens. Next, I think his extra-human locality is further characterized by Grendel's hatred towards the institutions of art. Namely the harp here, which might metonymically represent music, and the skilled poet, literature. The poem goes further in describing the content of this putative song, this poem, as giving a sense of continuity and identity. as it tells of man's beginnings. Art, then, in Beowulf appears to be something that particularly humans do, and that which Grendel finds particularly problematic. So I think these ideas are enriched further on, later in the poem, when Grendel's refusal to recognise human institutions are really, really sharply marked. His ravages are described in this way. He brings nothing but war, how he would neither parley or make peace with any Dane, nor stop his death-dealing, nor pay the death price. So here we have a really emphatic repetition of negatives: nothing, never, nor. And the association of Grendel with death emphasises he's an absenting presence, you might say. He absents the presences of the Danes, their art, their institutions of lords. And so in doing so, here Grendel refuses quite an important institution, a contextual institution within Northern European societies. And that's the institution of the law, here represented by the death price, which you also know is basically blood money, which is still a term you're probably familiar with. The blood money would represent, in this context, a legal mediation in a kind of dispute. You know, you kill my brother, you can give me some blood money, or I'll go and kill your brother. So, and I think the result of this is rather important. And I go back to Briscoe again, who notes this in his recent paper. Grendel's nighttime raids are thus not random hunts for human food, but rather targeted attacks on the heart of the social system, embraced and defended by the Danes. And I think this is quite important. This idea of attacking the heart of the social system is actually perhaps an unwitting metaphor on Briscoe's part, but Herot, the hall in which Grendel attacks, actually translates from the Old Danish as Hall of the Heart. So you might say, as close as you can get to attacking the heart of the social system. This is certainly a developed idea in the poem. So this is Grendel, and now I want to mention a little bit about a character in the scholarship who doesn't seem to get a vast amount of attention, and that's Grendel's mother. And here's our puppet of Grendel's mother, which was kind of half femme fatale, half fish. I think it would be a good description of her. But in the poem, the original poem, like her son, Grendel's mother is also associated with water. So she belongs to the fearful waters, the cold depths. And after her attack on Herot, she heads for the fen. So, of course, to reach her, Beowulf has to swim into her lair by entering the heaving depths of the lake. But the appearance of Grendel's mother is not a simple repetition. It's not like Grendel strikes again, Grendel 2. I think there's something different and interesting going on here. Because she's not repeating the attacks of her vanquished son. Rather, what's startling about her is that she's actually engaged in human motivations and human emotions. So we're told she would avenge her only child. And the poem construes her action in the following way when she attacks Herot again and takes back the arm that Beowulf has ripped off of Grendel. So here she's talking. Here the poet's talking about Grendel, and then moves on to Grendel's mother. He died in battle, Grendel, paid for his life, and now this powerful other one arrives, this force of evil, driven to avenge her kinsman's death. And additionally down here, but now his mother has sallied forth on a savage journey, grief-racked and ravenous, desperate for revenge. So the central difference between Grendel's mother and her son is that she is involved in a recognisable emotion, being grief-racked, and in a recognisable action, that of vengeance. Vengeance is a very, very important social action which is mediated, as we said before, by this idea of the death price, the blood money. And this is something that she's actually engaged in, and she seems to respond to a human institution here. So, and indeed, Beowulf's own search for vengeance mirrors her own. Again, as the poem describes Beowulf as the warrior determined to take revenge for every gross act Grendel had committed. So there's a parallelism here between Grendel's mother and Beowulf, and I don't think it's an accidental parallelism, because it not only brings Grendel's mother and Beowulf into inevitable conflict, but it also flags up the idea that an unchecked cycle of vengeance can only lead in absolute destruction and death. So we might think of the monsters in Beowulf then as somewhat standard, as others. That occasionally cross and corrode the boundary between the human and the non-human. So, for example, Donna Harmway has argued that monsters have always defined the limits of community in Western imagination. The centaurs and Amazons of ancient Greece established the limits of the centered polis of the Greek human male by the disruption of marriage and boundary pollutions of the warrior with animality and woman. So there are many examples that might fit this bill. We can think of the Minotaur, Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde, the alien from the Alien films, and possibly even Steppenwolf or the Orb of Solaris from Stanislaw Lem's Solaris. So this description, I think, fits the molds of the Beowulf monsters quite well, and especially for Grendel's mother. She is described as an Amazon warrior. And her gender features quite heavily as well. Not only is she called Grendel's mother, she's got a uterinal, her name is a uterinal association with another character, but also her productive powers. There are gynecological references to Grendel's unnatural birth when she appears on the scene. But while it certainly fits the bill here, I think there's something more complex and interesting going on with these two characters. Because what needs to be recognised is that something particular is being worked through with each monster. So with Grendel, we have the idea of art and law as being distinctly human institutions that he finds intolerable. And with his mother, we have the culturally important concept of vengeance being investigated and played through, and by bringing the monster and the hero conceptually and ethically close to one another. Now, I want to kind of move on and develop this idea of art a little bit more in the poem. I've already mentioned that art is a human practice, and but it's not just there as an othering device to say that, that which is human makes art, that which is not human doesn't make art. And I think indeed it pervades the Beowulf poem in many interesting ways, far too many that I can actually go into here, but I'll pick out a few. So when Grendel is first defeated, in Heorot, the king's poet performs several pieces, and they're described as words and music for their warrior prince. So this is Beowulf who's being celebrated. Now that these tales are included at all creates an intertextual network in the poem itself. And so we, as the actual listeners or readers of Beowulf, become at one, and rarely at one, with the characters that are in Beowulf listening to the poem. The omniscient narrator quite rarely fades away, and we are there within the Hall of Heorot, listening to this poem, and it's delivered by a poet you might say in the first person. So this has immediacy, I think, to the storytelling, and makes us epistemologically united with the characters in the poem. And also, I think more importantly, we have something here. Grendel seeks to quell human institution of art, and we have something which stands out against this. We have a resurgent performance, a live performance of poetry in the poem. So I think it was a really apt marker of the defeat of Grendel, in that we suddenly have this live poet performing. But I think it's also a marker of the importance of stories and storytelling within the cultural context. So poetry is described in the following way. So, meanwhile, a thane of the king's household, a carrier of tales, a traditional singer deeply schooled in the lore of the past, linked a new theme with a strict meter. The man started. So the level of detail here which it goes into about poetry is quite notable, I think. So this poet is a high-ranking thane. He's the repository of a culture. He's a carrier of tales. And a position which requires him to be deeply schooled in history. So while this poet-historian repeats old tales, he is also capable of originality should the occasion arise. And here it does. And the use of the verb here, link, is significant in that we have a narrative conceptually linking the heroic past with the heroic present, that of Beowulf's deeds. So Grendel may absent human institutions, but the poet and poetry makes them present again. So, and again we have down here, they sang then and played to please the hero, words and music for their warrior prince, harp tunes and tales of adventure. There were high times on the hall benches, and the king's poet performed his part. So here, Beowulf himself is cast as a fan of poetry and music. And these arts aren't only cultural theology, they're a way of telling of man's beginnings. but they're also divertissements or high times. So poetry really pervades the society, and it's fit for high occasion as for solemn. So when Grendel is attacking the hall, we are told, although we do not have, interestingly, we do not have a performed poem to this effect, but we're told that sad lays were sung about the beset king when Heorot is being attacked by Grendel. So all this, I think, confirms the importance of poetry in forging modes of conduct and a sense of identity in the listeners. And so it's no surprise that when on the verge of death, Beowulf should think of himself in dramatic terms. So this is when he's about to drown in the pool, in Grendel's mother's pool. And the poem tells us, Hygelac's kinsman kept thinking about his name and fame. He never lost heart. And Alexander, one of the translators of another verse form of Beowulf, points out the poem is concerned with leaders and their conduct. Plausibly then, men are driven to deeds and kinds of conduct by the examples they hear around them, by the music, the poetry, the heroic tales. So that's that concludes this sort of part, my looking at the original poem and some of the things I found most striking and interesting